Imagine walking into a room where no one looks up, no one notices your presence. You're not even seen enough to be ignored. This is the reality that millions of us face daily, the kind of invisibility that cuts deep. It's the quiet pain of not being enough, at least in the eyes of the people who should matter most. But what if that pain was the key to your freedom? What if letting go of their approval could give you the power to truly live? This is the story of how I stopped needing my family and built a life on my own terms. It was supposed to be a moment of celebration, a milestone in my life. I handed my father the keys to the truck, feeling a sense of pride and accomplishment. This wasn't just any truck. It was the symbol of all the late nights, early mornings, and endless hours of work I had put into building my life. It represented something I had achieved on my own, despite everything. But the response, it wasn't what I expected. He laughed. "Is this a prank?" he asked, his voice laced with mockery. My mother didn't even look up from her phone. She was too absorbed in whatever social media post had caught her attention. My brother snickered. "Since when do waitresses buy trucks?" The words stung, but I didn't let it show. I took the keys back, pushed them into my pocket, and said, "No worries, it's not for you anymore." Then I walked away. That was the moment I knew, the part that felt like a gut punch. But what nobody saw was the years of it, years of being overlooked, years of quietly shrinking in the shadows. They didn't notice the years of invisible effort I had spent, the small things I did that were never recognized. It was like trying to keep a light on in a hallway no one used. No one even noticed when the light went out. It's easy to look back on that day and feel the sting of rejection, but that moment wasn't really about the truck. It wasn't even about my father's words. It was the culmination of years of being unseen, being the invisible one in a family that only seemed to care about what they wanted. They had never noticed me before, and they certainly didn't start now. In that moment, I realized something critical. I wasn't going to keep fighting for their attention. I had spent my life trying to get their approval, but now it was clear I didn't need them to see me anymore. I could see myself just fine, and that was enough. Growing up in my family was like living in the shadows. I was the middle child, often the afterthought, the one who quietly did what she was told, kept the peace, and never made a fuss. I thought that if I just worked hard enough, achieved enough, I'd eventually get noticed, but it never worked out that way. My brother, the golden child, was always the one in the spotlight. He was reckless, always getting into trouble, but everyone forgave him. They admired him for his charm, for his ability to get away with anything. No one held him accountable. And me, I was the responsible one, the one who always did the right thing. But no one noticed. I could have disappeared for days, and no one would have even asked where I was. There were moments when I tried to stand out, to make myself seen. I worked hard in school, got good grades, and kept my head down. I thought that maybe, just maybe, this time I'd get the attention I craved. But no, I graduated, and no one came to my ceremony. I cleaned up after parties I wasn't even invited to. My efforts were always met with silence. The thing about silence is that it doesn't protect you. It doesn't make you invisible to your family, but it makes you easier to ignore. As a child, I thought that if I just stayed quiet, if I didn't make waves, I would be spared from conflict. But it never worked out that way. All it did was make me fade into the background. It wasn't just the big moments that hurt. It was the little things, the everyday moments of neglect. I'd bring something homemade to family gatherings, but it would sit untouched while store-bought items were praised. I would work to make everything perfect, and no one would even notice. I thought if I just kept giving, kept trying, they would eventually see me. but they never did. And the worst part? I let it happen. I let myself stay invisible, thinking that maybe, someday, they'd notice. I stayed silent, stayed small, and became the background character in my own life. It took years to realize that I wasn't invisible because of my actions. I was invisible because they chose not to see me. Thanksgiving had always been the same. It was a loud, chaotic event, full of too much food, too many opinions, and people who didn't really seem to care about each other. This year, I had planned to do things differently. I wanted to bring something meaningful. I thought, maybe, just maybe, this time they'd notice me. I made my father a special gift, a bottle of imported single malt whiskey. It wasn't cheap, but it wasn't about the price. It was about showing that I remembered him, that I cared. I also baked my famous lemon tarts, the ones he used to love when I was younger. I thought he'd appreciate the gesture, but when I walked into the house, nothing changed. The same chaos was unfolding. My mother was arguing about stuffing with my aunt. My brother was on the couch, playing video games, and no one even noticed me. I stood there for a moment, holding the bottle in one hand and the box of tarts in the other, and felt the familiar sting of being invisible. I placed the whiskey next to the cheap bottle someone else brought. I put the tarts in the fridge, just as I had done every year, and then I stood there, waiting for someone to say something, anything. But no one did. I walked into the kitchen, put my coat on the chair, and changed into a dress, royal blue, simple, just enough to be respectable. I thought maybe this would be the moment. Maybe this time they'd see me. But no. My mom glanced up, gave me a once-over, and said, "Is that what you're wearing?" Then she looked away. Dinner was as chaotic as always. The turkey was dry, the conversation strained. And when I finally spoke up, mentioning a promotion I had gotten at work, my brother laughed. "You're still doing that waitress thing," he said. And in that moment, I realized something deep within myself. No matter how hard I tried, I would always be the girl they dismissed. They saw me as nothing more than the quiet one, the helper in the background. That night, as I walked out of the house, I felt no anger, no sadness, just a quiet, unsettling stillness. I realized that this wasn't about me anymore. It wasn't about trying to fit in or make them see me. It was about accepting that I had been invisible for too long. And in that moment, I stopped trying to be seen by them. I stopped caring if they ever noticed me again. I left the house that day without a word, and something inside me shifted. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I didn't slam the door behind me, though I wanted to. It was as though I had finally woken up from a long, painful dream. For the first time in my life, I wasn't fighting to be seen, to be heard. I was simply walking away. And it felt good. I had spent my whole life waiting for my family to notice me, waiting for the acknowledgement I thought I deserved, waiting for the validation that would make me feel real. But I realized then that they had never seen me for who I truly was, and they never would. I could continue begging for their attention, or I could stop, and so I chose to stop. When I walked down that driveway, the weight on my shoulders began to lift. For the first time, I could breathe. I wasn't weighed down by their expectations, by their silent dismissal. I didn't need to explain myself. I didn't need their approval. And in that silence, I felt more alive than I ever had before. I walked away, not because I was angry, but because I was free. Free from the constant need to be accepted by people who would never truly see me. Free from the pressure of trying to be someone I wasn't, just to fit into a mold they had created for me. There's something powerful about walking away. It's not about revenge or getting back at people. It's about reclaiming your power and your identity. It's about finding peace in knowing that you don't need anyone to validate your existence. I wasn't the quiet girl anymore. I was someone who was finally ready to be herself, without apology. And as I boarded the bus, heading back to the city, I didn't look back. I knew the life I was going back to was mine. I had built it from nothing, and I would keep building it. When I got back to the city, I didn't waste any time. I didn't sulk or second-guess myself. I opened the cafe the very next morning, bright and early. The cafe wasn't just a business to me, it was my declaration of independence, my first step into a new life, and every day I poured everything I had into it. Early mornings, late nights, and a passion for creating something real. The first few months were tough. There were times when I wondered if I was doing the right thing. But with each croissant I rolled by hand, with each cup of coffee I poured, I felt myself growing stronger. I didn't need anyone's permission. I didn't need my family's approval. I was building something for myself. It wasn't easy. I had to learn everything, from handling the books to managing staff. I had no investors, no handouts. It was just me, my hands on the dough, and my vision of what I wanted this place to be. And as time went on, the customers started to notice. It wasn't instant, but eventually they did. At first, it was small things. A smile from a regular, a compliment about the pastries. But those little things kept me going. Slowly, people began to come in more frequently. They noticed the warmth of the cafe. They noticed the smell of freshly baked bread, the comfort of the space. But more than that, they noticed me. For the first time in my life, I wasn't invisible. People actually saw me. And it felt incredible. I wasn't just the girl who served coffee or baked bread. I was the woman who had built this place, from the ground up. As the business grew, so did my confidence. I started hiring employees, expanding the menu, and finding new ways to connect with my community. I studied business taxes, food safety, and even branding. I learned how to negotiate better deals, how to hold my ground in meetings, and how to stop apologizing for taking up space. It wasn't just about the cafe anymore. It was about becoming someone who was finally in control of her own life. Success didn't just come in the form of a thriving business. It came in the quiet moments too. In the mornings when I woke up at 4 a.m. to bake, I found a peace I had never known. In the evenings when I closed the doors and walked away from the cafe, I felt a sense of accomplishment that was completely my own. I didn't need anyone else's approval. I didn't need my family's validation. For the first time in my life, I was living for me. I wasn't constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering if my parents would finally notice my success. I wasn't checking my phone to see if they had left a message. I wasn't holding my breath, waiting for them to acknowledge me, and it was liberating. When I bought my car, a used one I paid for in cash, I didn't need anyone to congratulate me. I didn't need anyone to tell me I had made it. I parked it by the lake, ate one of my lemon tarts, and didn't feel the need to post it on social media. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone anymore. It was about doing something for myself. For years, I had thought that the only way to feel important was by being acknowledged by my family. But now I realized that I had been wrong. My worth wasn't tied to their opinions of me. It wasn't tied to their recognition. It was tied to the life I had built, the woman I had become, and the peace I had found within myself. I had achieved freedom, not just in my business, but in my heart. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their praise. I had everything I needed, and it wasn't something they could give me. It was something I had created on my own. Years passed, and I continued to live my life on my own terms. The cafe flourished. I moved into a new apartment, a beautiful space that felt like home. I didn't look back. I didn't miss them. I didn't need them. And then one day a letter arrived. It was from my father. Just a few words written in his familiar handwriting. "I need to see you before it's too late." I didn't rush to open it. I didn't feel the urgent pull to reply. I let the letter sit on my kitchen counter for days, unread. Part of me wondered what he wanted. Part of me wondered why he was reaching out now, after all these years. But I wasn't afraid. I didn't feel like I had to go running back. I didn't feel the need to explain myself or beg for their approval anymore. So I took my time. I didn't react right away. I didn't respond out of impulse. When I finally decided to go, it wasn't because I was seeking closure. It was because I wasn't afraid of seeing them anymore. I had nothing left to prove to them, and that gave me a power I hadn't known before. When I arrived at my father's house, everything felt oddly familiar. The scent of old candles lingered in the air, and the furniture, the same worn-out pieces from years ago, hadn't changed at all. The house, despite the passage of time, seemed frozen in place, frozen in the same patterns, the same indifference. My mother stood at the door, her face as unwelcoming as ever. "Oh, it's you," she said, not with surprise, but with the tone of someone who had expected something different. I walked past her, her lack of emotion as sharp as a slap. It didn't bother me anymore, not like it used to. Inside, my brother was on the couch, playing video games, just as he had been all those years ago. His life seemed to be on pause, while mine had moved on. He didn't even acknowledge me. I wasn't the one who had mattered enough to deserve his attention. I walked straight to the back room where my father was. His frail body lay on the bed, barely able to keep his eyes open. He looked different now, thinner, older. But when he looked at me, something in his eyes shifted. He wasn't looking through me, as he had done for so many years. He was looking at me. For a long while we didn't speak. The silence between us was heavy, not uncomfortable, but profound. I wasn't there to relive the past. I wasn't there to beg for any kind of acknowledgement. I was simply there to be. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he spoke. "You look different," he said quietly, his voice weak. "I am," I replied. There was no apology in his voice, no grand revelation of understanding or regret. But there was something else, a sense of acknowledgement, a small recognition that I had become someone he hadn't expected. And maybe, just maybe, he could see that now. My mother came in, wiping her hands on her apron. "She thinks she's too good for us now," she muttered under her breath. It wasn't a statement that surprised me, but one that stung just the same. Her bitterness had always been there, and in a way I had grown used to it. I didn't respond to her. I didn't argue. I didn't feel the need to defend myself anymore. There was nothing left to explain. They had their chance, and they chose to ignore me for years. Now I wasn't the same person anymore. My father, with trembling hands, asked, "What have you been doing?" I looked at him, knowing that his words didn't carry the weight they once did. 3 cafes, I said simply. 12 employees. 1 apartment, no debt. There was a pause. He blinked a few times as though processing what I'd said. It was strange. He seemed shocked, but not in a way that suggested he was proud. It was more like he was just acknowledging that I had done it on my own. For the first time in my life, I had created something that was mine, and I didn't need anyone's permission or approval to do it. Finally, he said, "We were hard on you." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an explanation, just a fact, a simple acknowledgement of the way things had been. But it wasn't enough, and I didn't need it to be. I was no longer the girl who had longed for their love. I had built something far stronger than that. I had built myself. He asked if I hated him, and I looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time in years. He was frail, older, and there was nothing left in his face but the wear of time. I didn't hate him, but I no longer needed him either. "No," I said softly. "I just stopped needing you." His eyes watered, and he turned his face away. But I didn't feel the need to comfort him. I wasn't there to heal old wounds. I was there to close the chapter, to look at him without the need to beg for his approval. And that was the final moment of closure for me. It was enough to simply leave, not angrily, not with resentment, just quietly. I stood, and as I left the room, he reached out and grasped my hand. His fingers were cold, dry. For a moment, he held it, but I didn't grip back. I didn't pull away, but I didn't respond. I just let him hold it, because I could, because it didn't cost me anything anymore. He let go, and I walked away. It wasn't long after that visit that I received the letter. It came from my father's lawyer, the estate, his will. A part of me didn't care. I had already moved on. I had already closed that chapter of my life, sealed it away in a drawer. But the letter made me pause. The will was straightforward, no surprises, except for one detail. He had left me something, a small savings account, a note attached. "You did it without me," it said. But I see it now. I didn't feel any surge of emotion when I read it. It wasn't a victory. It wasn't a vindication. It was just recognition, the kind of recognition I had spent years seeking. But now it felt hollow. I didn't take the money. I didn't need it. I didn't deposit it in my bank account. I didn't even mention it to anyone. I didn't need them to know. I didn't need to flaunt it. That was the point, wasn't it? I had built my life without them, and now it was finally being acknowledged. But their acknowledgement wasn't necessary for me anymore. I didn't attend my father's funeral. I didn't send flowers. I didn't write a eulogy. It wasn't out of spite. It wasn't because I was angry. It was because I no longer needed to be part of that world. When I received the invitation, I thought about it for a moment, but it didn't feel like my place anymore. They weren't my people. They never truly had been. Instead, I spent the day at my cafe. I served coffee, folded napkins, smiled at customers. I kept working because work was my redemption, not their forgiveness, not their approval. My life was something I had created on my own, and it was enough. The funeral was theirs, the grief was theirs, but the life I had built was mine.